Hey guys, hope you had a good weekend. Welcome back. I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the week to come. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is talking about some of the causes of the Civil War. We know, of course, that that's where, of course, this class will start. And so we want to talk a little bit about what we know as antebellum America. And I'll get to that in one quick second. I just want to remind you that there is a study guide in Canvas that goes directly with this presentation. If you choose not to listen to the presentation, which is perfectly fine, you can look at this PowerPoint and there are some notes. So if you don't put it in play mode, if you just kind of open the PowerPoint and look in the little notes section below each slide, I've put a couple of things in there that would help you understand a little bit better. Also, you could look at the Americans textbook. The Americans textbook is a great resource for all things American history. So if you prefer just to read, you certainly are welcome to do that. That study guide, incidentally, will be done, or due rather, at the test. So fill it out little by little. That was the design, is to just kind of little by little give you something to keep track of the content that we've covered. And so then just before the test, you could look through that study guide and pretty much have most of the answers and most of the content that you're going to need to know. All right then, so we'll get started. I want to take a minute and just make sure you guys understand the idea of antebellum. Ante, A-N-T-E, means before. Bellum means war. And so antebellum America just means before the war. Now, we've had several wars in American history. The war that we're going to be talking about is going to be the Civil War. The Civil War. I've never heard antebellum referred to in reference to any other war in American history. So this will always talk about, essentially refer to the time period before the Civil War. Now, the time period before the Civil War, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the 10-year period right before the Civil War. So like 1850 to 1860. It's a really kind of a tight window where a lot of things happen. But I do want to kind of kick it old school here really quick. I want to go back to 1820, and it seems kind of strange, but there's something that happens in 1820 that almost is a preview of what happens with the Civil War. So I want to talk just a little bit about it. All right, so incidentally, kind of by design or by coincidence, call it what you will, by 1819, there happened to be equal numbers of slave states and free states. Okay, so you'll notice on the left side, all of those free states where slavery either is outlawed, not allowed, or just isn't in practice. So New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, all of those states, if you look through, are states that happen to be geographically in the northern part of the United States. You'll notice, of course, that Wisconsin is not on that list because Wisconsin didn't happen to gain statehood until 1848. Looking at the slave states, states where slavery was legal, Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, some of those border states, on down through like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, those are all what we call deep South states. And those are states where slavery legally is allowed, and in fact, there's a heavy dependence on slavery in those states. Now, you might be wondering, like, yeah, who cares? You're like, why does it matter that there are equal numbers of slaves in free states? Well, what it comes down to is protecting slavery for those southern states. So if you're, for example, from Georgia and you're a slave owner, the one thing that you do not want to have happen is you do not want the United States government doing anything that would threaten your livelihood, that would threaten slavery. You don't want any laws passed that would somehow prevent you from owning slaves. They never could compete. Those slave states could never compete with northern states in terms of population. What that means is that if there's any bill or any law that originates in the House of Representatives, they're always going to be outnumbered. They can't compete in the House of Representatives. Representation is based on population. But the Senate, on the other hand, that's where they can stop any legislation that might be coming down the pike. So, for example, if somebody suggested that slavery should end in the United States, when it comes to a vote in the Senate, because every state has 2 votes regardless of population, because there are equal numbers of slave states and free states, they could put an end to any legislation. So southern states always kind of felt like they had some protection as long as there were equal numbers of slave states and free states. So in 1819, Missouri applies to become a state. Missouri's application for statehood would upset the balance. It would potentially mean that there would be one more slave state or free state, depending on how Missouri would want to enter. Now, this caused a big stir at the time. Okay, so in 1819, according to Henry Clay, a noted politician at the time, it's all that was on anybody's mind. Everyone was very upset about the potential that this balance would be somehow upset. Now, the solution was what we now know as the Compromise of 1820. Okay, now the Compromise of 1820 essentially stated that Missouri would be admitted as a slave state in 1821. So Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, and to make sure that they maintain that balance of slave and free states, Maine would be admitted as a free state. Most people at the time felt like, slavery isn't even feasible or practical that far north, and so nobody thought it was any big deal to have another free state that far north. Missouri, however, they felt like, what? There's some potential there, potential that they could possibly have some crops that could utilize slavery. Okay, so the Missouri Compromise was that Missouri would be entered as a slave state, Maine would offset it as a free state, and that balance would be maintained. Now, the idea, though, is that they want to make sure that this issue of slavery would be solved in the future. And so as you're looking at this map, you'll notice that the area to the left, this Spanish Mexico, is not part of the United States just yet. Not in 1820, that's not yet part of the United States. But they still have these little remains of the Louisiana Purchase. So they wanted to kind of make sure that in the future they wouldn't, every time a state wanted to join the Union, they just wanted to make sure that there wouldn't always be a battle. And so they decided to draw a line. It's called the 3630 line. And it's essentially this line that as you draw it to the west, they decided that anything that would form, any state that would form in the future that fell north of that line would be a free state, and any state that would form south of that line would be a slave state. And the idea was that they were hoping to solve the slavery issue for future generations. Now we know that it just actually put off the slavery question for the time being. This is an issue that will come up again, and we'll pick that up with the Compromise of 1850. But for right now, you have to understand that this was a hot issue as early as 1820. People were thinking about, what do we do with these newly acquired territories? Should they be slave states? Should they be free states? And the solution was this 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise line. So you want to understand that that's a very important line, and it's a first attempt to deal with the issue of the expansion of slavery. Now, I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about the change that happens. But before I do that, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause this video, and I want you to go into Canvas, and I want you to watch the Ed puzzle on the cotton gin. I've put an Ed puzzle in Canvas. It's under modules, and it's in my page of plans. You'll notice the date. I've linked it there too, so there's a couple different places you can find it. It's about 4 minutes long. I want you to go ahead, watch that Ed puzzle, answer those questions, then come back to this video. So if you watched that video and completed the Ed puzzle, you would have known that the cotton gin changes everything with how the South develops. Okay, so you'll notice on this map Southern cotton production in 1820. Okay, so we picked up, it was the time of the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820. This is Southern cotton production. You'll notice the major production areas really small. A couple of other production areas kind of scattered throughout the South. One of the things you want to know about cotton is it was, at least in 1820, very labor intensive. It just took a lot of effort to remove the seeds from cotton, and so it wasn't something that was ever really practical to grow in the South until the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin, like I said, changes everything. And you'll notice then a mere 40 years later what happens. Okay, so I'll go back. Okay, look at how cotton production changes and how it grows. And look where it grows. Okay, so look at the red here near Columbia, South Carolina, and look at where the red spreads like a rash over to the west, because that's where the land is. It's not like they're going to be able to spread north. The climate just can't support it, and you can't spread south. Well, a little bit south, but you can't grow it in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So cotton production essentially is very profitable with the cotton gin, and starts to spread to the west. Now, that idea of king cotton is something you want to remember, because the South would become very dependent on cotton for its livelihood. Okay, and everything's interconnected. Northern factories need that cotton, and so the South, that's where they're making their money. Now, what's the trend with slavery? All right, so what you want to know in this inset map, okay. First of all, let's look. Always good practice. Take a look at the title. It says Slave Population Patterns, 1790, which is just after the Revolutionary War, and 1860, which is just before the Civil War. Okay, so you're looking at, like a 70-year span. Okay, so in 1790, you can see that there's a lot of colors on this inset map. What do those colors mean? Is you look down, it says percentage of slaves in the total population. Okay, so 50% or more, 30 to 50, and then it gets lighter in color as the percentage of slaves go down. So the more slaves there are, the darker the color it seems. Okay, so looking at this inset map, a lot of the slaves up here in Virginia, North Carolina, into South Carolina, not so much obviously here in the deep, deep South. Now, as you look at this other map, the bigger map, you'll notice that you have a lot of slaves continue, of course, into Virginia, in North Carolina and South Carolina, but look at the growth in slavery as you move west. Okay, so by 1790, you can see that the bulk of the slaves, or people using slaves, has moved into the deep South. Okay, so the question you say, like, what is the trend with slavery? That can be answered pretty simply. Also take into account this little graph, African American population 1790 to 1860. You'll notice that the total numbers of African population, slave and free, slave being, of course, in green, slave population is going up, and free population is kind of not going up, but kind of staying steady. So you definitely want to pick up on the fact that the slave population in the United States is growing. And it's really not enough to say it's growing. It's growing dramatically between 1790 and 1860. And there's a direct correlation between the invention of the cotton gin and the need for cotton and the percentage of African American population. Okay, so there's a direct connection between African American population and the invention of the cotton gin. So essentially what it comes down to, and what you want to pick out of this, is that when the cotton gin is invented, okay, seemingly something that would make life simpler and less labor intensive actually has the opposite effect for African Americans. We see a growth in slavery. You see a desire to gain more land, to grow cotton. And when you have more land, you need more laborers to grow that cotton. So we see a vast expansion of slavery. All right, so that's all I have for you today. Tomorrow I'll pick up with the Compromise of 1850 and how things change between like 1820 and 1850. For right now, though, you should be able to finish questions 1 through 4 in that study guide. If you want to move forward this week and you can get a bunch of questions done by looking at videos and completing all your tasks early in the week, that's fine with me. So in any case, we'll talk to you again.